All right, everybody, welcome back. It's time for a deep dive. And today we're tackling a topic that's been generating a lot of buzz lately, prison reform. We've got a pretty interesting combo of source material for you today.
Oh, yeah.
First up, we've got H.R. 2931, a bill fresh out of the 118th Congress.
Hot off the presses.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And to add some fuel to the fire, you also sent us this really powerful YouTube video from Black Catalyst all about the human side of incarceration.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how those two perspectives kind of like come together, I think, because obviously one very policy heavy, we talk about the nitty-gritty of legislation, and then the other one's very much about, the human impact and the emotional side of this issue.
Exactly. So ready to kind of get our hands dirty with some serious policy analysis, but also keep in mind the human stakes of this whole debate.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right, so let's jump right into the deep end with H.R. 2931. Now, the official name is the Smart Sentencing Adjustments Act.
Catchy.
Yeah, gotta love a good snappy title. Right? But I gotta say, despite the name, this bill is anything but vague.
Right.
This thing lays out a very, very specific, and some might even say ambitious plan to reduce state prison populations.
Ambitious is an understatement. This bill sets a goal of a 20% reduction in state prison populations.
20%.
That's massive.
That is huge EE. I mean, are we talking about just like throwing open the prison doors here? What's the game?
Yeah, no, not at all. This isn't about some mass release program. It's a much more calculated approach. The bill actually proposes this two-step grant program for states.
Okay, so it's like a carrot and stick kind of thing to incentivize reform.
Exactly. So the first type of grant is a planning grant. And essentially what this does is it gives states funding to take a deep dive into their own criminal justice system and really figure out why their prison populations are so high in the first place.
So it's kind of like a know-before-you-go approach to prison reform.
Yeah.
You can't fix a problem if you don't know what's causing it.
Exactly. It's all about data analysis, looking for trends, identifying the root causes of mass incarceration at a local level, because the bill recognizes that, different states have different challenges, right? There's no one-size-fits-all solution here. But here's the catch.
There's always a catch.
There's always a catch to get to the really big bucks. States have to move on to step 2 of the program implementation grants.
Ah, so this is where the rubber meets the road. They have to actually put their money where their mouth is.
Exactly. And these implementation grants come with some serious cash. But to get them, states have to actually implement the plans they developed in step 1.
So it's like a built-in accountability mechanism.
Exactly. It ensures that states are serious about reducing their prison populations, not just, going through the motions to get some extra funding.
So the big takeaway here is this isn't just about letting people out of prison. It's about changing the system itself.
Absolutely. And that is a really critical distinction to make. H.R. 2931 isn't about, opening the prison doors and hoping for the best. It's about really looking at the system and saying, okay, how can we do this differently? How can we create a more just and equitable approach to incarceration?
Okay, so we've established that this bill isn't about Band-Aid solutions. It's about real systemic change. But what does that actually look like on the ground? How are states supposed to use these grants to actually reduce their prison populations?
Well, the interesting thing about H.R. 2931 is that it gets surprisingly specific. I mean, we're talking about actual concrete steps here. One of the big ones is sentencing reform.
Okay, yeah, that's been a hot topic for a while now, right?
Yeah.
Especially with all the debate around mandatory minimum sentences.
Exactly. For years, the U.S. has relied so heavily on these mandatory minimums, particularly for drug offenses, and it's really led to some arguably overly harsh sentences.
Yeah, it's hard to justify like a life sentence for a nonviolent drug offense when you really think about it.
Right. And there's a growing consensus that these mandatory minimums, they haven't really worked, and they've disproportionately impacted minorities and low-income communities. So H.R. 2931 actually encourages states to rethink those mandatory minimums.
So giving judges more leeway to consider the individual circumstances of a case instead of just throwing the book at everyone.
Exactly. It's about bringing back some of that judicial discretion and, maybe handing down a sentence that's more fitting to the crime and the individual.
Makes sense. And didn't the bill also mention something about downgrading certain felonies to misdemeanors?
Yes, that's another big one because that could have a huge impact on prison populations. I mean, think about it. A felony conviction, it follows you for life.
It's like a scarlet letter, right?
Yeah.
Affecting everything from jobs to housing to even voting rights in some cases.
Absolutely. And that's a big part of what this bill is trying to address. It's not just about reducing the number of people behind bars. It's about acknowledging the ripple effects of a criminal record and how it can trap people in a cycle of poverty and recidivism.
It's like trying to outrun your own shadow, right? But this bill goes beyond sentencing reform too, doesn't it? I feel like we're just scratching the surface here.
We are. There's a lot more to unpack. For example, the bill also pushes for expanded parole eligibility, especially for people who have served a significant portion of their sentence and have demonstrated good behavior.
So it's about recognizing that people can change, that rehabilitation is possible, and giving them a second chance.
Right, because the goal shouldn't just be to punish people, but to help them reintegrate into society and become productive members of their communities. And speaking of reintegration, that's another key focus of H.R. 2931.
Because it's one thing to release someone from prison, but it's another thing entirely to make sure they have the support they need to actually stay outright.
Exactly. Just releasing people without addressing the underlying issues that may have led to their incarceration in the first place, that's setting them up for failure. And we're talking about things like job training, housing assistance, mental health services, substance abuse treatment. All these things are crucial.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Except in this case, it's more like give someone the tools they need to rebuild their life and you reduce the chance they'll end up back in prison.
Right. It's about breaking that cycle. But it's important to remember that this bill isn't just about handing states a blank check and saying, go fix it. There's accountability built in.
Yeah, we touched on that earlier. No cutting corners.
Right. States can't just shuffle inmates around to different facilities to game the system, and they can't enact new laws that would actually increase incarceration rates.
So there's real emphasis on transparency and making sure states are committed to reform for the right reasons.
Absolutely. Now, while H.R. 2931 lays out this incredibly comprehensive roadmap for change your other source, the Black Catalyst video brings in a whole other dimension, the human side of this issue.
Right, because we've been talking a lot about policy here, but at the end of the day, this is about people's lives.
Exactly. And that's what Black Catalyst does so well. They remind us of the human cost of incarceration.
So let's talk about that video you sent us, the one by Black Catalyst. What were your main takeaways from that?
Honestly, what struck me most was just the raw emotion of it. We can talk about recidivism rates and, the economic impact of mass incarceration, but this video really brings home the human cost, the impact on families, the children growing up with a parent behind bars, the stigma that follows people even after they've served their time.
It's easy to forget that we're talking about real people with real lives.
Yeah.
Not just numbers on a spreadsheet.
Exactly. And I think one of the most important points Black Catalyst makes is that even if someone has committed a crime, that doesn't mean they should be stripped of their dignity. They deserve to be treated humanely. They deserve a chance at rehabilitation, a chance to turn their life around.
It makes you wonder if maybe our current system, with its emphasis on punishment rather than rehabilitation, is actually counterproductive.
Right. And Black Catalyst makes a really interesting connection between H.R. 2931 and the legacy of the 1995 crime bill, which has obviously come under a lot of fire for its role in fueling mass incarceration.
Yet some people argue that the 1995 crime bill really marked a turning point in how we approach crime and not necessarily for the better.
Right. And Black Catalyst sees this new bill, H.R. 2931, as a potential step in the right direction,
Right.
a chance to kind of course correct and undo some of the damage that was done by those tough on crime policies of the past.
So it's like we're at this crossroads trying to reconcile our history with our hopes for a more just and equitable future.
Exactly.
This deep dive has been quite the journey. We've gone from the really granular specifics of a single bill to these huge questions about justice and equality and second chances.
It's all connected, though, isn't it? You can't talk about prison reform without talking about sentencing guidelines, reentry programs, racial disparities, and, of course, the socioeconomic factors that contribute to incarceration in the first place.
It's all part of the same system. But I think what we've learned today is that change, IS possible, HR 2931, whether it passes or not, it's a sign that people are starting to question the status quo and look for real solutions to mass incarceration.
And Black Catalyst, they remind us why this issue matters so much. It's not just about abstract policies. It's about real people's lives.
And recognizing that everyone deserves a chance no matter what they've done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to everyone listening out there, I think the big question we want to leave you with is this. What if we invested as much in preventing people from ending up in prison in the first place as we do in locking them up? What if we really focused on addressing the root causes of crime, poverty, lack of opportunity, mental health issues?
Now that is something to think about.
Yeah.
And on that note, we're going to have to wrap up this deep dive. For more information on this episode or any of the topics we discussed today, head over to our website, And as always, thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.